Well, hello everyone, and welcome to a new video on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, coming to you from Jackson in the state of Tennessee, here in the United States of America. And today I want to do a podcast in which I will be talking about some of my favorite jazz performances of Beatles songs. And the reason for that is that, just a few weeks ago, I sent in a recorded question, to one of my favorite Beatles podcasts that is available at the present time, which is I've Got a Beatles Podcast with Dave and Chris. Dave Thurmaier is a college professor of music that I have had the chance to interview on the channel, and I will leave the link to our conversation in the description of this video. We talked about the Beatles, and he and Chris Bragg, they do one of the most interesting Beatles podcasts that you can find around these days. There are many Beatles podcasts, and many of them are really good, but this one is particularly good because it's fun. There's a great rapport between Dave and Chris, and you can feel that when you listen to the show. It's a podcast that shows that these two guys are really knowledgeable about the Beatles, but they also have fun doing what they do. They're very good friends, and as a result, anyone listening to the show will really feel that fun and really enjoy their conversations. I listen to it on Apple Podcasts, but they also have a website that I will also link to in the description, because that way you'll be able to access all the episodes that they've recorded. And in fact, they've recorded 200 episodes, and it was on the occasion of that 200th episode that they were asking listeners to send in some audio questions. And I sent in a question about the Beatles and jazz. What are their favorite jazz performances of Beatles songs? And they said that they hadn't really thought about that much, that they hadn't really done any episodes about the relationship between jazz and the Beatles, but they did come up with some good selections, and in fact all the selections that they mentioned are among my favorites. So let's talk about them, and then I'll add just a few other selections that I really enjoy. So starting with Wes Montgomery and A Day in the Life. This is one of their choices, and it really is a good one. This is a Wes Montgomery recording for CTI Records around the time in his career in the late 60s, when he was veering towards the more pop end of the musical spectrum. The album that this song is taken from is actually called A Day in the Life, and it was produced by Creed Taylor for CTI. That was his label, and that kind of tells you more or less what the kind of sound is going to be like. It's going to sound like a big production number with an elaborate arrangement that goes really well for a song like this. Wes Montgomery, being the great guitarist that he was, he gets into a certain groove and just never lets go from beginning to end. It's a fine performance. You can tell he's playing A Day in the Life, but you can also tell he's playing around with it quite a bit. And the album, and this track, features jazz greats like Herbie Hancock on piano, Grady Tate on drums, Ray Barretto takes care of some of the percussion, bassist Ron Carter is also on hand. So some people might say that this Wes Montgomery album is a little too poppy, that it's not jazzy enough. I completely disagree. It's a very groovy album, very interesting recording, and a fine choice from Chris and Dave. A Day in the Life by Wes Montgomery. They also mentioned McCoy Tyner, who's one of my favorite jazz pianists. Long career, great discography. And She's Leaving Home is the song that he performs, McCoy Tyner. And it really is an exciting, lightly swinging reading of a song that doesn't get performed too often. She's Leaving Home from the Sgt. Pepper album. McCoy Tyner here does not necessarily try to recreate the song too much. Very often he sticks to the melody, but he actually does get into these moments where there's this lightly swinging groove, this lightly swinging mood that he gets into that I always find appealing. And I think it's interesting that the way the Beatles do this song, it sounds kind of sad, it sounds kind of gloomy, but McCoy Tyner sort of finds the fun part of it. It finds the sunnier side of this Paul McCartney composition. She's Leaving Home. McCoy Tyner, that's another great choice by the I've Got a Beatles podcast guys, Dave and Chris. The next one is one that I absolutely love. They mention Lena Horne, and who doesn't like the singing of Lena Horne? I think I just love pretty much every album by Lena Horne that I've ever heard. My all-time favorite one would be Stormy Weather, that she recorded, I believe, in the 1950s. But years later, I believe around 1969, 1970, Lena Horne got together in the studio with Hungarian guitarist Gábor Szabó and recorded an album simply called Lena and Gábor, and that includes Rocky Raccoon. And their version of Rocky Raccoon is fantastic, a kind of funky reading, rhythmic, percussive, some nice guitar, of course, from Gábor Szabó, and some organ, also some vibes. But most of all, an astounding vocal performance by Lena Horne. On that album, in fact, she also does something in My Life and The Fool on the Hill. So several other Beatle tracks on that Lena and Gábor album. And I believe she even does Everybody's Talking, the Fred Neil song that was a big hit record for Harry Nilsson, another artist that I know Chris and Dave really appreciate. Interestingly, this brings to mind the fact that Benny Goodman also performed this tune a few years later during his 40th anniversary concert at Carnegie Hall. Benny Goodman performed a legendary, epoch-making concert at Carnegie Hall back in 1938, and 40 years later he appeared there again for a 40th anniversary installment of that concert, kind of reviving that vibe, which is almost impossible to recapture. And it's not a bad concert at all, but one of the songs that he chooses to perform in this 40th anniversary concert at Carnegie Hall is Rocky Raccoon, and I think Jack Sheldon does the vocals. It's not bad, but well, it's nowhere near as good as this version by Lena Horne and Gábor Szabó. I'm going to have to go back and dust off that album because I haven't heard it in a while. Another album that I think is very interesting, even though it only includes one Beatle track, has to do with the next choice from Dave and Chris, which is Grant Green's reading of I Want to Hold Your Hand. To me, Grant Green has always been one of the greatest, most soulful guitarists in jazz history. And I have pretty much all the records by Grant Green that I've been able to find. And in fact, I would recommend anybody out there that doesn't know who Grant Green is to just go out and find some of his albums, because he was absolutely fantastic. And he does I Want to Hold Your Hand. And in fact, it is the title of one of his Blue Note albums. He titled the album after that song, although none of the other songs, there's Stella by Starlight, for example. That's another song on there, which is a standard. So the other songs are not Beatles songs on that album. But it is a good album. And his version of I Want to Hold Your Hand, well, he slows down the tune, plays it almost in a bossa nova style with some organ, with some saxophone, but the main thing here is how he reinvents the song with this different beat, slowing it down. You can tell he's playing I Want to Hold Your Hand, but not quite. And that's exactly why I think this works so well. It's just a different beat, it's slowed down. Grant Green does an absolutely marvelous job on I Want to Hold Your Hand. And of course, the rest of the album is well worth a listen, just like everything else that Grant Green ever recorded. That was another good choice from Dave and Chris, and I think it was Dave that chose that one. He is very interested in guitarists, so his other choice is also by a jazz guitarist, and it's George Benson and his album The Other Side of Abbey Road. It's an excellent 1970 album by a fine guitarist that I love, who also does vocals on some of the tracks on here. For example, Golden Slumbers is a song that includes some vocals by Benson himself. That's another Creed Taylor produced album, in this case for A&M Records, so you can imagine that the production is going to be impressive, that is going to veer towards pop. But what a fantastic album. Benson just shines throughout the album and is surrounded by great names such as Herbie Hancock on piano, Ron Carter on bass, Ray Barretto again on percussion, Ed Shaughnessy on drums. Really good record, The Other Side of Abbey Road by George Benson. Now, he does not perform all the songs from the Abbey Road album. And if anything should be criticized about this album is that it's just a little short. But it's the kind of record that you can't just play once. If you just get in the groove, you'll enjoy the sounds. Really well played versions of these tracks. And I bet that if you play that album, The Other Side of Abbey Road by George Benson from 1970, although I think it was recorded in 1969, but anyway, it was released in 1970, and I'm sure you won't be able to play it just once. I say that very often. There are records that I listen to once, and I can't just listen to them once. I just play them all over again, and this is one of those. Not just because it's short, but because it really is very good. So Dave, Chris, those were really good choices for jazz versions of Beatles songs. I also asked Dave and Chris what they thought about the Beatle-related recordings that the great Count Basie made in the 1960s. One of the albums that Count Basie devoted to the Beatles songbook came out on Verve in 1966 and is called Basie's Beatle Bag. Now, Dave and Chris liked some of it, didn't like all of it. It is swanky, that is for sure, as I think Chris mentioned. But it really has always been one of my favorite Count Basie albums from the 1960s. And that's a lot to say, because Count Basie recorded some fine albums in the 60s, including some with Frank Sinatra, Sinatra at the Sands, Might As Well Be Swing, and Sinatra Basie. But this one is an exciting album. It is a surprising album in many ways. It features imaginative arrangements by Chico O'Farrill, and that's always a good thing. That's always a good stamp to have when it comes to a 1960s album like this one. And of course, there's a solid band that gathers in the studio for this recording with some of the usual great Basie players, like Al Gray on trombone, Eddie Lockjaw Davis on saxophone, Freddie Green on guitar. What a great guitarist Freddie Green was as well. That was another, there are two great Green guitarists in jazz. One of them is Grant Green, the other one's Freddie Green, and he's on here too. Sonny Payne on drums. So a good addition of the Basie Orchestra. It is true that Count Basie was not too convinced about this project. Probably was forced to do it or encouraged to do it by producers, by Verve. He didn't necessarily want to make it. It's just a way to make some money, I guess. But it was musically successful, I think. It's an album that I come back to once in a while, and I like playing it, listening to it. And must have been successful enough because in 1969, Count Basie would record another album of Beatles songs called Basie on the Beatles. That was not on Verve, though. It was on a smaller label, and it wasn't as successful. It wasn't either as musically satisfying. So if you want to listen to Count Basie doing Beatles covers or reworking some of the Beatles tracks, I would suggest you look for Basie's Beatle Bag before you dive into Basie on the Beatles. So that would be a choice for me, really. Basie's Beatle Bag is a good, actually, contemporary in the album, in the sense that it was released in 1966, around the time when the Beatles would be working on their Revolver LP. Another full album that I enjoy, that is in this case a vocal album, was recorded in 1977 but only released in 1981, and it's an album by Sarah Vaughan called Songs of the Beatles, released on Atlantic in 1981. I believe there were some contractual problems or some kind of problem that prevented the album from being released in 4 years. It was recorded in 77, didn't hit the record stores until 1981. Now, some of you that may know the album might say, "You're crazy, that's not a great album." Well, what I think is that the arrangements reflect the time when this album was made. It was recorded in 1977. Now, the arrangers were Marty Page and his son David. I love Marty Page. I think he was a great arranger, fine musician. I have a lot of his albums. But the arrangements, as I said, reflect the times. The vocal performances by Sassy, though, are usually marvelous. I really enjoy listening to this album, even though I am aware of the arrangements sometimes being a little bit overly dramatic. In fact, jazz critic Leonard Feather in the LA Times criticized the arrangements and the background singers at the time that the album was released, and it actually was not very well received, this record by Sarah Vaughan. It is not necessarily one of Sassy's best efforts. It's not going to go down in history as one of her greatest albums for sure, but it is still a valuable record, and it's a record that actually grows on you fairly quickly. The personnel includes Brazilian musician Marcos Valle on one of the tracks. I believe it's Something. Lee Reitner as well, and harmonica player Toots Thielemans. So some fine musicians around Sarah Vaughan. Most of the songs, admittedly, are post-1966 Beatles. I think And I Love Her and Yesterday might be the ones from before 1966. But some of the tracks here, despite the arrangements, are really memorable. In fact, the version of Here, There, and Everywhere, in my view, is just an excellent vocal performance by Sarah Vaughan, and one instance in which the Marty and David Page arrangements were not bad at all. They're not overly produced or too dramatic in that case. So Songs of the Beatles, 1981, though recorded in 1977, an album by Sarah Vaughan that I would encourage all Beatles fans out there to discover or rediscover, or at least give a chance and listen to it. And finally, I'm going to end this short discussion of Beatles and jazz versions of Beatles songs, by underscoring the importance of a Ramsey Lewis Beatles version that may not be as well known as some of the others that we have discussed before. It's Ramsey Lewis Trio recording a track from his Wade in the Water album on Cadet Records from 1966. It is a good album, all of it really, and it includes a soul-inflected reading of Day Tripper. Yes, the Beatles single Day Tripper. Very exciting version. And it is, as I said, a soul-inflected reading of Day Tripper with some soulful piano playing from Ramsey. There's no way Ramsey Lewis can play a song that doesn't sound soulful. In many ways, he's a little bit like John Wright, the pianist John Wright in that sense. And this one, Day Tripper by the Ramsey Lewis Trio from 1966, has always been one of my all-time favorite jazz Beatles tracks. The only thing that I would criticize about this version is that unfortunately it fades out. And those of you that have been following the videos on my channel, you know, because I've mentioned it before, I just don't really like it when the songs on the recordings fade out. I really don't. But that's the case with this Day Tripper. It doesn't detract from the value of that performance. And Ramsey Lewis, definitely a very soulful pianist, and one whose work I always appreciate. So there you have it. This has been a response to Chris and Dave from I've Got a Beatles Podcast. I encourage everyone out there to seek out, to look for that great Beatles podcast, because it really is one of the best around. Every time they publish a new episode of the podcast, it's a fun day for me, because I really enjoy listening to their banter, and they just don't take themselves too seriously, and that's a good thing, because they're having fun, they're knowledgeable, and they know how to transmit their knowledge by means of the podcast. I want to close by saying also that, with the Beatles, most of the times, I think pretty much in all cases, I prefer to listen to the Beatles' own versions of songs. And I feel like Beatles songs are so very much associated with the Beatles that it is very difficult to do them in a way that will be sellable, that will be different. I think the best versions, at least in jazz, of Beatles songs are those that depart from the sound of the Beatles, and they are inflected with the sound of the performer that's reworking them. But it's very difficult to do so, and I think, in pretty much in all cases, I prefer the Beatles' own versions of songs. Even in the case when you have great versions, like Joe Cocker's With a Little Help from My Friends, which is really good, or Fats Domino's Everybody's Got Something to Hide, except for Me and My Monkey, which he did for Reprise Records in the 1960s. Those are cases in which the versions kind of get close to the Beatles versions, but it's very difficult to really rework a Beatles song in a way that it will work better than the Beatles' own version. So I normally listen to them side by side with the Beatles. No need to compare or no need to compete or anything like that. Another, it's not necessarily a jazz version of a Beatles song that I've always really enjoyed, that I've always been partial to, is the Frank Sinatra version of Something. I think Sinatra really did a great job with Something, even though apparently he believed that Something was a Lennon McCartney song. I think later on he learned that it was actually a great George Harrison composition, and he often mentioned in his later years that Something was, if not the best, one of the best love songs that he had ever heard. Which, it's high praise coming from somebody like the chairman of the board. He does a good job with Something as well. I don't consider it to be obviously a jazz version, so I did not include it, but I can't finish this podcast without mentioning Sinatra and Something. And now, as I wind down this podcast, I just want to ask everybody out there, which ones are your favorite jazz Beatle performances or jazz performances of Beatles songs? Do you coincide with what Dave, Chris, and I have brought up? Are there any others that, of course, we didn't mention because there are several others that you enjoy? Well, just leave all that information in the comments section of this video, and I will love to hear from you. Thank you for listening. Thank you also, Dave and Chris, for everything you do to further the legacy of the Beatles music, and you do it in a fun, very enjoyable way on I've Got a Beatles Podcast. This is Anton Garcia Fernandez signing off from Jackson in the state of Tennessee, here in the United States of America. I recorded this podcast in the middle of August of 2022, and you will be able to listen to it very soon on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. Mine is the copyright of this podcast that I dedicate specifically, and I send out specifically to Dave Thurmaier and Chris Bragg from I've Got a Beatles Podcast. Thank you very much for listening, and so long, everybody.